Okay, so I absolutely despise JavaScript, and I want you to see this because this is just the console, and is there a way to just count errors? To just count the number of errors that are in here. Like, can we see the 15 errors just from Facebook alone. We go and we open the browser console over in YouTube and everything, and nobody ever fixes these errors because JavaScript is basically set up so that everything runs no matter what, and so we can see the errors that are available here over here, and then we open the browser console over on similar worlds, which apparently does a lot better at managing RAM, but even still, you're still looking at six different errors that are not ultimately handled. And then the really disgraceful part about it begins here. So you can see this, and I have to, unfortunately, when it tells to share screen, it doesn't show all of it, but see, Firefox itself is taking 900. Facebook, Facebook right here is taking at least a gigabyte. Similar Worlds is at least decreasing in size, but YouTube is another gig. My GPU is taking a gig. My extensions, I realize I have a lot of them are taking their own gig. And all of this is going on, and I've heard the saying that wasted RAM is unused RAM is wasted RAM, but as a point of dissent from that point of view, it's like, what if I wanted to run Discord at the same time, and I wanted to run Torzu, which, by the way, it's the Nintendo Switch emulator, that replaced Yuzu, by hiding behind a Tor hidden network. I've got that, up and running on this system. What if I wanted to run that at the same time and run Discord and everything else and browse the web at the same time as all of this? Pretty soon, with 1, 2, 3, 4, and then all this, add all this memory up and together, and what the total ultimately comes out to, and it's got to be quite high, just to run a few tabs, of this calculator. So 908, 908. This is driving me crazy. Plus 1000. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. So that's 4,000. I mean, so you're already talking about 4 gigs just to run that much out of 16. And Discord would be another 1 gig. The operating system itself is going to be a gig. So, the operating system itself, and then pretty soon there isn't much left over for the game. You've already you're down to 10 that are free at that point, at the very least. And I mean, this is not a good and efficient way of using RAM and utilizing it on the system. It goes through it adds up, and it starts to stack very quickly. And I mean, if I'm realistically using my browser, having just this many tabs open is not normal for me. This is just extreme tab discipline that you're seeing on my part. I usually have a lot more than this open and running at the same time. I mean, I'm out of Blue Sky, for instance, which, by the way, let's look at how big its memory footprint is in this, task manager. So, a Blue Sky instance is, that's coming out. That's, another 400 meg at this point, you know. So it stacks very quickly. It can add up, and then you run into trouble very, very, very rapidly. And this is ultimately the problem with JavaScript. Like you're not getting proper error handling. Your errors are not being resolved because nobody wants their sites to crash, and so errors are allowed to persist in the code, and they're not corrected. They go up on the website and nobody ever addresses them. You've got problems. And because it runs, it runs, it but it and it works, but it only works just good enough. you know, which is a problem because nobody takes pride in their craft anymore. And then, on top of that, you've got the massive memory overhangs and the fact that it does that, and then you've got the terrible, just god awful JavaScript syntax, which, oh god, it's a nightmare in of itself. Like the triple equal signs and everything, and these glaring warts. There's a lot of them in the language, and then the language was only designed to do very small, very small programs that just added a little bit of interactivity to your web page, and yet now people are trying to make massive, unwieldy applications out of it, and do very large enterprise scale software in JavaScript, which is just obscene. Like, first of all, like, the idea of using a scripting language in the first place to do something that is enterprise scale is absurd. It's the wrong tool for the job right off the gate. You've got the wrong tool for the job being used. But front end developers were saddled with the fact that the only tools that they had in their toolkit were JavaScript, PHP, and HTML and CSS. So what I wanted to say about that, and that front end of, at least as far as web development is concerned, is just that was the state of things for the people who only knew that stuff. If they didn't know a language like C, if they didn't know a language, like Rust, but now Rust is new, so it's more like C or C++ or C Sharp in the .NET years. If you didn't know that stuff, you couldn't go about trying to implement a third language for the web and for the front end side of things. The whole problem with this is just that those other programming languages have existed for years and years and years, and it wasn't until WebAssembly that developers had other options. But the thing is, there were developers out there that had the skill sets that were required, to bring something else to the front end that would have, liberated us from, and actually made for lightweight applications rather than, what we've seen instead, which is applications that use a fucking gig of memory. And like I said, I mean, if you saw what we were able to get done in the I'm trying to remember, those guys, the Wares guys, the scene, the oh, that community that did that, oh god, I'm having trouble memory-wise at the moment. The demo scene. Yeah, the demo scene. If you had seen what the demo scene had been able to get done, and the size of their programs, and how large it took for them to do what they did with it, you would look at this and you would look at the size of the memory that it takes to do even some basic shit like this, and you would be stunned and horrified, because those guys actually had pride in their craft, and they took pride in squeezing as every bit of performance, and and keeping the memory footprint as low as they possibly could, in things. They believed in that. They did it, because they wanted to show off how skilled and talented they were, and they took pride in their skills and their craft as programmers. But that's not the modern development paradigm. The modern development paradigm is one of fuck it, we'll just do what it takes to get paid, and it's awful. Everything has gone to shit, and web developers have, and JavaScript, you know, they've just done what it took to get paid, and now everything sucks. You know, everything's crap and garbage. There's no pride left in their craft. There's nothing, really going on, and that like modern computing has become a hellscape, and unfortunately, because of the fact that there weren't tools available, people just kept piling more and more and more shit, snowballing it on top of JavaScript. And now that there's something better that's around, it's still incredibly entrenched and very difficult to get people to learn Rust and to use other, programming languages to migrate us away from it. It's still a massive impediment, and the big problem is that so much code has already been written in JavaScript that the prospect of rewriting it in Rust and WebAssembly is daunting to a lot of people, having to redo things all over again, especially because they redid things all over again and reinvented the wheel 10,000 times within all the JavaScript frameworks and everything that have come and gone over the years. Pile on that, on top of that things like Node.js were never designed to be secure. They were incredibly vulnerable to supply chain attacks. Whether the developers intended them to be or not, as a consequence of the way that they were designed, they were incredibly vulnerable to supply chain attacks. Because they're all, it's dependent, on a bunch of different individual packages that are maintained by developers and referenced constantly. Every time you run a website, you're calling that a new instance of that program. So if that program director gets phished and then updates the software, a bunch of, anybody that depends on that package is now stealing, relevant information from end users and everything, and people that use that particular software or go to your website or use your software packages, and they steal a bunch of very, very important data as a consequence that was meant to be kept secret, and you run into all these issues that pile on top of it. I mean, this is a language that has so many glaring warts. The fact that it is able to be cross-platform compatible is just not ultimately worth the trade-off for developers. I know that they have been bewitched by this, I can write it once and it will run on everything, but the fact of the matter is that it's not really like that anyways. I mean, you'll bitch and moan about the way that when you wrote software for one system, you had to write new code to port it to a new system with C. I mean, you didn't have to rewrite the software entirely, but you did have to write some new code with C to port it to a new system and everything, and as a consequence of all, that and the problems with that, the difference with JavaScript is that you still end up writing just as much. You still end up having to rewrite your code and refactor it just as many times, because you're in an ecosystem, right, where you're dependent on 1,000, different modules that come in from, they're third-party modules that come from somebody else and are constantly referenced, so that every time your website, loads, it loads the newest version of that package, which means that if that package, like I said, if the people maintaining that package ever get successfully phished, well, now everybody who visits your website is leaking their username and password to the hacker, and it's, I mean, this is the nightmare world that we live in, and people talking about it like they don't want to be part of a world in which Node doesn't exist, or that Node dies. Node dying would be progress. It would be one of the best things to ever happen to the world. The fact that they took JavaScript out of the web browser was a fucking mistake. It has been built on a mountain hill of lies and bullshit. They try to market themselves as lightweight, but they're heavy. they're not at all lightweight. In the way that Qt BitTorrent is lightweight. They're resource hogs. They're big, bloated, heavy applications, and to call themselves lightweight is an insult to lightweight software. It makes a mockery of the concept. The world needs to be, and the world of front end development needs to be migrating away from JavaScript and JavaScript frameworks altogether, and JavaScript runtimes as fastly as it possibly can. The end of JavaScript cannot come soon enough.